Hello, welcome to a presentation on Gluck. Christoph Gluck is, after Handel, the most important composer of opera seria in the 18th century. And as you can see from the map, he's as well-traveled, in fact, even more well-traveled than even Handel. Again, indicative of the cultural life and political life of 18th century Europe. So, Gluck was born in an area where what is in now Bavaria or southern Germany. Keep in mind, in the 18th century there was no Germany, no unified state of Germany. There were German-speaking peoples and German-speaking areas of Europe. But there was no actual nation of Germany, nor was there a nation of Italy. They both were just a disparate organization of city-states, small principalities, kingdoms, etc. At a very young age, his family moved to what is now Bohemia, or the Czech Republic, not far from Prague. He grew up and studied there. It seems he left home at some point, but not exactly sure when. He lost track of him for a while until 1737, about at the age of 22 or so. He shows up in Milan. Obviously, he's interested in composing and composing opera. There he studies with composer Sammartini and writes 4 operas, all to libretti by Metastasio. Remember, Metastasio is by far the most important librettist of the early 18th century and the opera serie style. So with some success under his belt, he makes his way, like Handel, to London. London, remember, is the largest city in the world, the richest city, and the place to go to try to make the biggest success as a composer of opera seria. He produces a couple of operas. They don't impress Handel. He makes a rather snotty comment about Gluck's mastery of counterpoint, as you can read here. But the fact that Gluck is not, Gluck is not that interested in counterpoint, and this little exchange, or at least this comment by Handel, is indicative of the emergence of a new style, of which Gluck is at the center of its development. That's the classical style. This is, of course, goes across genres and disciplines, affects art, painting, architecture, and of course music. It's an attempt to recreate, again, that classical Greek style, the kind of clean, symmetrical divisions. And this structural clarity that you see in this door here is reflected in music as well. It's a reduction of this kind of Baroque complexity. And Gluck's music is the best example of it. So after a couple of years in London, where, as you may recall, opera seria is on the wane there, he comes back to the continent, where opera seria is still extremely popular, especially it's almost exclusively in the courts. He gets an important commission in Dresden. The Duke of Saxony is not the most powerful ruler, but one of the most has one of the most lavish courts in all of Europe. So this is an important commission. It gets him back onto the continent, and what follows is opportunities to write operas virtually all over Central Europe. There's one in Copenhagen, far north. He gets a commission down in Naples, at the other end of Central Europe. He gets 4 commissions in Prague, more work in Vienna. So in this period around 1750, Gluck is all over the place. It's pretty clear he is extremely popular, no matter whether Handel likes him or not. He finally settles down in 1752. He's appointed a music director of an important court orchestra. Now, you can probably guess from Handel's comments, Metastasio didn't think much of Gluck's music either. Gluck himself didn't think that much of Handel and Metastasio. In fact, he was becoming frustrated by the strict conventions of opera seria musical style and the style of libretti. And he wasn't the only one. The other people in Vienna, the director of theaters, Count Durazzo, had traveled in Paris and was very impressed, not just with French serious opera, but with also French opera comique, and particularly their flexible structure and he imported some into Vienna. Gluck adapted these; they translated them into German, but also Gluck changed some of the music to adapt them for Viennese taste. But he learned a great deal about this more flexible and simpler French style. And that led him and others to try to reform Italian opera seria. The work that they presented was as an example of their new reforms is the Orpheus story. They're consciously going back to the very beginnings of opera. And they suggested that they were doing so as a way of recreating the kind of true spirit, the original spirit that drove the Florentine Camerata back in 1600. So, we have a new Orpheus and Eurydice. This is quite different than the Handelian opera seria, and it owes a lot to the French opera comique, particularly in the tableau style, the incorporation of dance, reliance on accompanied recitative, no more secco recitative, and a much simpler vocal style and musical style, shorn of that complex counterpoint. So I have 4 YouTube excerpts here from Orpheus and Eurydice. This opening tableau is a perfect example of the scenic structure. You'll recall how Lully's operas were organized in these tableaux which had fairly short musical numbers within a larger scenic structure and a much greater variety. Chorus, dance, aria, recitative. So compare that to the openings of Paris and Monteverdi's Orpheus stories. Also compare the high point of the drama is that moment where Orpheus is leading Eurydice out of hell. In those earlier operas, the composers present that dramatic moment fairly quickly. They spend a lot of time setting up the story. Gluck does the opposite. He spends little or no time setting up the story. He just jumps right into Orpheus's mourning Eurydice's death at the beginning. But this moment when the dramatic high point when Orpheus is leading her out of hell, that Gluck spends an enormous amount of time. In fact, that's where he focuses all of his energy. In fact, it's not only it's accompanied recitative, it's a series of duets, little short arias between Orpheus and Eurydice, finally reaching the moment where he turns, looks back to her, and loses her. And then he sings his famous aria, Che farò senza Eurydice. Wonderful description of this in your text, The Story of Opera. So Orpheus and Eurydice in Italian was quite successful. He followed up with another opera, Alceste, and his reputation spread. It was also helped by the fact that one of his young students, the daughter of the Empress Marie Theresa, grew up to marry the Prince of France and later became Queen of France. You know her, she's Marie Antoinette. So that enabled Gluck to, there was a sort of a connection that enabled him to sign a contract to write several operas for the Paris Opera and to adapt earlier works. So this adaptation is very interesting. Gluck originally wrote the role of Orfeo for castrati, as was expected in the 18th century. But the French audiences had never embraced castrati. They were as offended by this practice as we are today. So he adapted the opera, and he made the role of Orpheus into a tenor part. He also wrote several other operas, and this became, late in his life, another flourishing. So here is an excerpt from the same Che farò senza Eurydice, but now adapted for tenor in French, J'ai perdu mon Eurydice. So in the life of Gluck, we get, in one person, a sense of how important opera seria is and how pervasive it is in all of Europe. And also how it changes from a rather stilted Baroque style into a much more dramatic style. And that sets the stage for developments in comic and serious opera in the late 18th century and for Mozart.